join us soon. Today we are talking about CSS specifically. So I understand that Gabe went over some HTML with you yesterday, and it looked like it was a good exercise, and grateful he did that. So hopefully you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with that. And CSS is a layer of abstraction above HTML, but it's super liberating in a lot of ways for allowing the web to become what it's become, as opposed to when it was just straight markup in the early days. So let's dive right in. And I wanted to start out by going over the code that I shared in Slack, and hopefully you've had a chance to grab that. And I'd like you to copy and paste it into your index file in the folder that we've been working from. And we'll be building off of that to create that mockup in HTML and CSS over the next few days. So let me share this screen here. Okay, I've got that same code in my index.html file. It's in my HTML Fundamentals folder, and whatever you name that folder that you saved on your desktop or wherever you saved it, that's the file that we're going to be working with. I shared those images as well, and those images should be inside of that same folder, but in a new folder that's labeled images. So you should have, let me just show you on my desktop how it's structured for me. So I have my HTML Fundamentals folder, I have my images folder, and all of those images, those ping files that I posted in Slack have been saved inside of that. And then I'm using the index.html to put that code in that we talked about today. So there were some slight differences for how this final code set up from what I had typed in as I was demonstrating. So I just wanted to point those out, make sure that everything was clear the way that it was structured currently. So we start out with our doc type declaration and our HTML tag. It says we're using HTML. Then we have our head, and right now we have just the title in there, employee dashboard. And we have the body tag, and then we have a header tag, and then the nav, we've actually got our H1 employee code inside of that nav code or tag, and that's just to keep all of that cohesive because each of those will be part of that nav area. We have the 3 hrefs, and then the image source with that person, Diego Di Iorio. Then we have the main section, and you'll notice that we've started using comments in this code. I showed you how to make comments, but this is one way that comments can be used in HTML that helps give clarity, makes it scannable for somebody coming through looking for a specific part of a page. Those tags can help them view that and find that more easily. So we have the header section, the main section, and those comments, and the main tag. And then we've added all of those specific elements. The image of the person, their name is an H2, customer support rep as an H3, and then anchor tags, links to the phone number. And then this is something new, are these hrefs. There are the ability to create a link that will open an email program when you have this mail to designation on this href, and then for tell as well on a mobile device, tapping that number when this is designated would actually open the phone's dialing properties so that you could make the phone call from just tapping on that link. So those are changes that we've made that we didn't actually talk about yesterday. Each of the images has their alt tag in place in this one, so showing what would be available to a screen reader as opposed to the actual visual representation. We have all of the elements, and there's actually additionally a footer section that we've got in here that has 2019 employee information and links to privacy in terms of service at the bottom. So we've had this additional section. So just wanted to walk through that. Does that Does anything there raise any questions for you?
No, but I just wanted to confirm you want us to copy this over into our index file, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay.
I'd like you to have that because as we go through, towards the end, we'll be typing into this file after we've demonstrated some of the CSS, making changes. And so I want that to be something that you work with and can do.
Okay. And I did have one clarifying question about anchors. So what exactly can you add to an anchor? Like what other attributes and what is the function of an anchor?
So the anchor tag has, it has two uses. One is an anchor tag is meant to be a link. So the attributes that you add to an anchor tag, actually, let's open this up in H3 schools or W3 schools, sorry. And we'll look at HTML. And let's see, tag list, the A tag. So you can add a lot of different attributes to this, and this is something you would probably want to dig into on your own, but the main one is for href. But anytime you create an anchor tag, you're really wanting to create something that somebody can click, and then that interaction will either take them to a new page or open up a mail to email somebody or to make a phone call. But it's basically an interaction tag.
Okay, so its main purpose is to create a link between something.
Yep, from your page to some other page or interaction. Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. One thing actually I remember that I needed to talk to you about before we dive in too far into the CSS today was I wanted to just give you a heads up about Build Week and the end of this unit, because I believe there's been some questioning and concerns about that. Because the way we've structured this unit, we have the 2 weeks of HTML and CSS and a week where we review portfolios and talk about creating a good portfolio. So getting into Build Week, we're not actually collaborating with developers as part of that Build Week. It's just an internal to our unit. And we are working on our portfolio design, and we're doing there will be some code challenge as well. Nothing too intense, I don't think. But basically wanted to let you know that that's the plan, is that no collaborative Build Week, and it's just working really, it's helping you get a leg up on your portfolio, being ready to jump into labs. So hopefully that gives you some sense of clarity and maybe eases some concerns. Does anyone have any questions specifically about that?
Are we expected to build our portfolio using this course, this HTML and CSS?
No.
Okay.
We don't feel like what we're telling you is going to be enough to get to that point, but there will be a challenge that helps you practice and demonstrate that you've learned the basic fundamentals. But
Okay.
really, the design is going to be designing in Figma. Really, just getting a comp of what that final portfolio will look like.
Okay.
Essentially. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention is this will probably be more relevant for this unit, but we have the Lambda way of doing things in terms of trying to figure things out on your own. So we've established the Lambda way of the 20-minute rule. You really, if you're running into a roadblock, give it your best shot of Googling or trying to find out an answer for 20 minutes, or trying to struggle through. But we don't want you to be blocked so long that it really impedes your ability to complete the assignment. So if you're hitting that 15, 20-minute mark and you really at a standstill, go ahead and reach out to your TLs, seek help from the help channels, but don't stay stuck for too long, but do really give it a good solid try to figure it out on your own. And I just wanted to reemphasize that, because as you get into some of these things, CSS becomes a little bit more complex over the next few days. it's good to just reach out and figure out how to find out answers on your own to the extent that you can. And then we're happy to help. But what we also want to do is build that resiliency in yourselves that you can know how to find those answers and figure things out. And it's a very rewarding thing when you do as well. So just a little bit of a tidbit there. And now back into what we're talking about. One of the things that we talked about with HTML is thinking about some of the tags that we put on a page as layers, similar to the layers that we might put into a sketch file or a Figma file, where we have pieces that we want to work with. But then when we have those pieces on the page, we want to give them color or style that helps differentiate them from everything else on the page. And so we go and use that right-hand panel on those tools, the contextual menu that helps you change fonts, change colors, and add other attributes. And so CSS is really like the tool on the right-hand side, those toolbars, that gives us that set of tools that allow us to change what the HTML looks like. So that's one way to think about it, to help conceptualize what cascading style sheets are. The cascading part of style sheets is referencing the ability of different layers within the CSS to be able to override each other, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. I just wanted to let you know what cascading means when you're talking about CSS. And when we're writing CSS, we're essentially creating a new file. Just like we've got an HTML file, we also have a CSS file. So what we're going to do is go ahead and create that now. We have our folder where we've been working so far this week. We're going to go ahead and add a new file, and we're going to name it main.css. And the naming convention will vary from organization to organization, but main is a good generic title that you can use to create a CSS page. Now, we'll start writing CSS, and we're going to, I'm just going to put a generic code in here, and I'm going to say color is red. This is CSS syntax, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now I'm going to save that file. When we're going to reference a tag or a CSS file in our HTML document, we do that in one of the sections that we've already designated. Can anyone guess what section that might be in, that where we would place our reference to this CSS page based on what we've discussed so far?
The main section.
Main? Why would you say main?
Because you named it main.
Okay. It's a good logical reason. That's actually not where we would put it.
It's in the head.
In the head?
It goes in head.
Great. Yeah, that's right. So in the head, we talked about this head as being something that's not displayed to the screen. It's the meta information about the page. And so I'm going to go ahead and just paste this in here. What it is a link. This is a tag that doesn't have an opening closing tag because it's self-referencing as opposed to going around content. So that is similar to the image, where the image tag has just a source and an alt, and that's all there is. There's not other content that's referencing. The link is the same way, and it's basically telling the HTML document, there's a file I need you to go and get, and then retrieve the information so that we can use it in this HTML page. So the rel is the type of document that we would be reaching out. So in this case, it's a style sheet. So we give that attribute to the link, and then we give it an href, and this should be familiar to you because it's an attribute that's used in anchored tags as well. So the href is a URL that the application can go and look for. And because we have it in the same folder, main.css, then we know that the browser will know just to go into the same folder that the index.html file is in to look for this main.css. That's how that link works. So let's look at our employee dashboard. Close this out for a second. So this is what the HTML looks like just when we've got what we have in there. There's the H1, we've got our H2s and H3s, and then our links, the anchor tags, and the images. And it just plops them right onto the page like that. Now, I have created a CSS, which this designates the text color, this actual code. So I'm just going to refresh here and what happened? Did I not save something?
Save it maybe?
Try that again. Save the file, the link main.css should be, there we go. Must not have saved one of those files. That's an important thing to realize. It happens all the time if you're working and you forget to save, because we're used to working in browsers where everything is saved for us nowadays, that those changes will be reflected. But you can see that the color changed in all of the text because of that. So we've now connected a CSS style sheet called main.css into our HTML, and it's referencing that. So any changes that we then make in our CSS page will become reflected in that HTML. What questions do you have? Do you have anything that you'd like me to address? Got the Slido open.
Can you go back over the style sheet attribute?
In the index?
Mm-hmm. Where's that coming from?
Sure, yeah. So basically what we're doing here is we've created a link tag. We've designated what it is so that the browser will know how to deal with it. And then we've given it a reference to look up, which is the main.css. And that main.css file is the same one that we just created. So main.css lives in our file structure now. I'll just pull that up here. Now that I created it inside of my main folder where there's index, there's also a main.css file. And so this tag allows the browser to recognize that, okay, this file is in that same folder, and I will grab it and pull it and understand its contents and apply it to all the HTML that's in this file.
Okay.
Did that answer the question?
I get that for the main.css, but the rel style sheet, where is that and what is that?
Okay, so this is an attribute explaining what type of file that we're going to be grabbing. So we'll be talking a little bit later about style. Let's see, there's style sheets and there's scripts, which is using JavaScript, and font files, I think, are also rel. Okay. But that there's just referencing to say, okay, if I pull in this file, what is it that I'm going to be looking at from the computer standpoint? Does that make sense?
Style sheet is in reference to CSS.
Yes.
Okay. Yep. Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. Okay, let's talk a little bit about selectors. Selectors are what they sound like. It's selecting something, because we have style sheets that we know about, and we have HTML code that we want to style. We need to figure out how the CSS is going to select which HTML piece that we're going to be styling. So in something like Sketch or Figma, we can just click on a layer, and then we know that that layer is selected, and so we can start doing our attribute changes in that right-hand contextual menu. With CSS, we don't have the benefit of point and click, and so there has to be some sort of language that tells us select this element so that, and then make this change to it. And that's what we'll be talking about now. So this syntax that we're dealing with is the same across all pieces of CSS. So the selector is the first item that we name. So in this case, what we have here is a star, and this is a very special selector, which means basically select everything on the page and apply these attributes to everything. So that's why when we made this live, our dashboard turned all of that text color red because it was selecting everything. If we were to give that a border, we give it 1 pixel black and solid. Because it's selecting everything, as soon as we refresh, there's only a black border around every element on the page. So this is something that's not used very often, but that's the primary selector that you can choose from. The next things that you can choose are elements. So in HTML, we have the elements which basically equate to the tags that we're creating. So we have our main element, we have a section element, we have an image element, we have an H2 element, and these elements could be repeated. So if there's a section, there's multiple sections, then if you select the section element, it will change all of those sections. So let's look at that. If we were to change H2, we do curly brackets. So basically we're doing a selector, and then the curly braces tell us this is the CSS contained between this beginning and ending bracket that we want you to apply to that selector. So if I want to change the H2 to be a different color than the other elements on the page, then I would choose, let's say, purple. Let's save that. And these anchor tags are all still red because of the code up here. Now I've designated the H2 should be purple, and so all of the names of these individuals are purple because I've taken the selector of H2 and applied a style to it. So now we have a selector with another style. So we have elements, we have the everything selector. We also have what's called classes. And we can, this is another way that we can help make the different pieces look different within there. So we may have multiple H2s, but we want some of the H2s to look different from the other H2s. But we still want to be able to apply that styling across multiple H2s. So let's say we make a class in our HTML as an attribute. So we know about attributes already. Is the nomenclature for an attribute is to name the attribute. So in this case, it's a class. Then it equals, and then quotations. That's the way we always do those. And I'm just going to name this special. So I've created a class. I hit save for this H2 to be special. Now I'm going to apply that same class to another H2 down here. Class equals H2. Go back to CSS, and the way that we do a class selector is using a period. So we type a period and then the name of the class that we've created. And this is a selector that then allows me to select all of the special H2s. And I will do a font size and we'll do it at 22 pixels. I think I misspelled something. The class font size. Do point instead of pixel. There we can see the big difference there. Going back to look at the classes I created. Do search special. But I thought I had done a second one.
It was in Vince.
Say that again.
It was in the Vince's profile. Vince.
Oh, I wrote H2 instead of special.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. It's always embarrassing being caught on film. Okay. So we have Vince and Diego, both having that special class. So we're able to designate a new selector as a class. There are selectors that are called pseudo classes as well. And pseudo classes are a keyword added to a selector that specifies a special state of the selected element. And they can be used for selecting specific elements, but are usually used in conjunction with other selectors. So let me just show you some example of some of the pseudo selectors that are available. The pseudo classes. The syntax for writing a pseudo class is going to be the selector with a colon and no space, and then pseudo class, whatever that class is right after it. And the standard pseudo classes are things like active, disabled, and you can use some of these other ones in JavaScript for selecting pieces of a nested architecture of HTML. But probably the most common use case for early developers is going to be the hover example of a pseudo class. So we'll go and apply that. We're going to go hover, where we're selecting an element, and then the hover state of that element. And then we're going to call it color green. Okay. So we have all of these hrefs which come up as links. Right now, they are showing in red. So I refresh, and now whenever I hover over them, they turn green. So that's coming through that pseudo class. So with the CSS, I'm able to select different interaction states of individual elements or their classes to be able to give them special attributes for those special states, like hover. So that's an example of a pseudo class. And one more selector type that I'd like to talk about is the ID. And an ID can be thought of just like your own driver's license and identification card. something that shows you are a unique individual and it's who you are. So any HTML page can have any element can have an ID, but it can only be used once on that page. For example, we have this H1, and we might want to give that an ID because it's the main logo. So we're giving it the ID of logo. Now I can't use the ID logo anywhere else on the page, but that messes up the structure of the HTML and CSS. So giving that attribute logo, then I can begin to assign something to that. The way we designate an ID selector is by hitting the pound sign, the hash sign, and then the name of the class, which is ID, or the name of the ID, sorry. And the ID that I just gave it was logo. And so our logo is this employee. And so we're going to give that a color, yellow. And each CSS declaration for any selector can have multiple different styles, where so far I've only been doing one style at a time. I can do a different change here as well. Font size. We'll do 80 fonts. So we're giving it multiple attributes. It's saved. And now we have a garish yellow employee sign. That allows us to select one individual element on the page. You can have different elements that have a different ID. So if this ID, for example, the H2, we needed for some reason to give it a very unique signature of some kind, we say ID equals name. So that becomes an ID that only this one element has now, and that is name. So we could give that, we can have multiple IDs on a page, but only each ID can only be used once. All right, what questions do you have about IDs, and classes, and selectors, everything that we've gone over so far? Website. My main.css file doesn't have a blue hashtag on the left. Did I make a mistake when creating it? What I'm curious what it looks like. Normally the IDE will recognize the file based on its tag at the end. So the .css or .html will give it that label. And I'm not sure what might have been done if you named it something else.
Sorry, I figured it out. I had actually
Okay.
typed it in as CCS, and then yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
I should have made a comment in the Slido that I figured it out.
Okay, cool. Glad you figured it out. Figured it out on your own. Awesome. Okay, great. Any other questions that I can answer right now?
So I'm trying to make a link between the symbol, like for example, how you have the hashtag or pound sign, which relates to ID, or A with a colon relates to, what was the other one?
That's a pseudo class.
Pseudo class. So is this just memorization, or is there a relationship chart that we can see between HTML language and CSS language?
It's probably in this case, for most of these, memorizing what that relationship is. If you think about that, you can reference any tag as an element. So that's where this works here. And then the class designation with the period, and then the pound designation for an ID, and then pseudo class, making that connection with just the colon between an element or a class or an ID, and then whatever that pseudo class would be. And really that's about all you would have to remember from a memorization standpoint. And then there are more tags or more pseudo classes and things than you can probably deal with ever, and it would certainly be a boring thing for me to try to go through and name all of those. So learning that if I know what a class is and I know what an ID is, you can really quickly Google that and say, okay, how does this work again, and get the syntax if you need it. And that happened to me a lot, especially as I was first developing, like, and even now coming back and teaching the class again after not developing for a while, just Google it to make sure I've got my syntax right. And that's really how developers do it. As they get familiar, the more you use it, the more easily it comes to you. The less you use it, then it kind of fades away and you have to go refresh. Did I answer the question that you were asking?
Yeah, you did. Thank you.
All right, awesome.
I actually had a question. So right now for the colors that you've been inputting, you're just typing in like red or purple or green. But a lot of times when we're designing, we're using more specific colors than that.
Mm-hmm.
How can you just like put in the hash code?
Yeah, absolutely.
With the number ID instead of writing red or purple?
Yeah, for example, in this IDE, you can actually hover over and choose, select an individual color if you want. And it's giving the RGB declaration, and that's one way of approaching it. But you can also just do, for example, page 45 FFF, and that ends up being a blue color. So that's a good, that you can use RGB designation, which you saw the RGB with the parentheses and then the RGB codes associated. In here we have a hex code. All of those are viable approaches to coding it. And then there's just some predetermined colors that are coded into HTML and browsers so that they recognize this is red, this is blue, this is aquamarine. There's a ton of them, but yeah, you can definitely use those very specific colors you're designing for.
Cool.
Awesome, great question. Cool, let's talk just a little bit more about ways that you can represent these selectors in your code. So you may have, for example, an H2 that you want to give the size, font size 18 point. And you also want to give your H3 that same font size. Rather than have to actually type that twice in your CSS file, there are shortcuts for being able to designate lists of elements or classes that you would want to apply a CSS code to. So in this case, we just do comma separated lists, and we do H2 and H3. And I can delete this. And that will have the same effect as if I had them both entered in twice. And these lists can be as long as we need them to be, and they could include class declarations or ID declarations. So if we go back and see, all of those sizes have been reduced to 18 point because I've put them into this list. So you can create this list with however many you need, and it's very handy to be able to do that with large amounts of changes that you need to make across different types of classes or elements. You can also select a descendant of an HTML element. So let me talk about how that works. So we have a section here, and then we have of that section, which are image, H2, H3, and anchor references. So if I want all of the anchor tags inside of all of my sections to be a certain style, but not necessarily all the anchor tags. So if they're in the nav, for example, I don't want those ones to change, then I can use a designation of a descendant. The way that we do that is I name the section, which is the item, the tag that's associated. And then I do a space, and then I designate the anchor tag as the item that I want to change. So this is giving us basically a way to reference nested elements within HTML. So all of the anchor tags within that section should now be able to be changed by me. And if I say I want the color to be green, and refresh, now all the links that are inside of sections, all those anchor tags have turned green, but my anchor tags that are not in those sections are not. And down in the footer is also a section. So those have turned green as well.
How would you take the underline though? You know how the A's are underlined?
Mm-hmm.
How would you take that off?
So that would be a CSS declaration of, well, let's just do that here. Let's see, I think it's text decoration. Let's see it. I may have to Google that one to remember. Yeah, that worked. So basically, it's a CSS declaration of text decoration, which can either be underlined or not. And there's other attributes associated with text decoration, but by just declaring none, then that removes that underline from those links. So virtually all of the style that you can see on the page can be adjusted through CSS. All right, we have gone over selectors, which include our the everything element and the everything's asterisks. Then we talked about elements, or the actual HTML tags. We talked about doing classes through the dot class name, and then the ID with the hashtag, whatever the ID name is. And then we talked about pseudo classes as well, where we have the colon after an element or a class, then whatever the pseudo class is. Then we talked about IDs and selector lists, being able to combine them, and then also finding a descendancy combination to be able to find elements. Any questions about any of this so far? Let's look at Slido again, see. All right, let's talk a little bit about specificity here before the top of the hour. Specificity is in reference to what elements or what CSS can overwrite other CSS, because you may have noticed that when I wrote the H2, H3 font size change, there was already a font size declaration up here for the special class, and for the H2, or it was for the logo. So each of those had different font sizes, but by writing this, I was able to override those. And this is where the cascading nature of CSS comes into play, that we're able to designate whatever is the most recently coded element or piece within CSS will overwrite previous design designations. So specificity is a way that is applied to a given CSS declaration, and it is determined by the number of each selector type in the matching selector as well. And when multiple declarations have equal specificity, the last declaration found in the CSS is applied to that element. And specificity only applies when the same element is targeted by multiple declarations. I don't know if that is confusing, but let's open up a code pen to talk through this a little bit more. Let me share this link with you. Drop it in the Slack channel. So you can watch along as I'm doing it here. Okay, so what we have in the left-hand side here is a paragraph as a class. It's called paragraph. And then we have a paragraph that has an ID of primary. It also has a class of paragraph. And then we have the content within each one of those. So with the everything declaration, we've declared the color to be red, and you can see that this is red text in all cases. Now let's go ahead and I use the quick key of when I select it and command and I did the wrong one. Command, sorry. Command / either will comment out or uncomment it. You notice this is very similar to comments in HTML in that, but in HTML, when we want to make a comment, we do exclamation point and 2 dashes. And then we can make comments in here that don't show up. Similarly, in CSS, we can use this /*, and that can comment out whatever follows that. And you close out a comment by having */ again. There's a quick key in the IDE where, and in CodePen, where if you do command / when it's selected, it will comment it out and not. Just a little side note there. So when we're looking at paragraph, we're getting more specific. And so that's what we're talking about, specificity. Up here, we're very general. We're saying everything is blue. Now we're getting more specific and we're saying p tags should be blue. Whereas this was red, now we have paragraphs which should be blue. So the more specific HTML or CSS declaration overrides the more general one. So now we've got another p tag, but this one comes later in the flow. So because it's more recent, then it's making everything be green. So again, we're getting to more specifics. This is much more specific because it's talking about the tag. Then this is more specific because it's more recent. Now we get into class declarations and getting even more specific. So let's uncomment this one as well. Right. Now we are dealing with the class. Paragraph color green. Let's actually comment this one out again and see what happens. Keep hitting the wrong quick key, which makes it not quick, very quick. Okay, we hide that. So because this paragraph was, or the p tag was meant to be blue, then we're adding a class to that. We're getting even more specific. We're talking about all p tags that have the paragraph declaration selector. And so they're still green. So if we comment this one out just again, it turns blue because that's going back to the previous specificity. more specificity. Okay, here's an example of a pseudo class, which is the last of type. So if you recognize this syntax, we have our item, and then we have the colon, and then the pseudo tag, and then last of type is referring to in any HTML document, you find that last p tag basically, and so the color is purple. So now you can see the specificity of that pseudo class is more specific than the class, and so that will override the color declaration in paragraph. And one last one is that an ID becomes even more specific than a class because we're talking about an individual element. So when we uncomment that, then the ID will override the pseudo class, it will override the class, it will override the paragraph tag. And so we end up with black. So this is where the cascading nature of CSS goes, and it's that law of specificity. The more specific you are in reference to an element in your CSS, that is going to be what ends up being the deciding factor of that CSS. All right, what questions can I help answer right now about specificity, if anything?
For elements with the same class, how would you make two different elements with the same class different colors?
So if you want some of these elements that have the same class, different colors, you can either give them a new ID or give them an additional class and then make that additional class the last declaration. So for example, let's see, we can use this specificity. We'll create another paragraph with a class equals paragraph and test 3. So this class has a green color because it is following this specificity. This one, because it is the last of type, becomes purple. So that's one way to make it change color, but that's only going to be going to the last one. So I'm going to comment this one out. Now it turns back to green. And one way I might want to give it another color is I'm going to give it another class, and you can add as many classes as you want to any element in CSS or in HTML. And these attributes are just added by adding a space. So this becomes a new class that I can reference in CSS. So now I have a class called unique, and I'm going to color orange. And it changed this one. Even though these have the same class, I've added another class so that I can override that one in certain specific instances. And so that's one way that I can do that. And because because it's last in line, then it's going to override that other class. If I put it in front of this, you notice that it doesn't change because this paragraph class is the most recent, and so it's going to be considered the most specific. Even though it's unique is listed later here, it's the listing order in here that allows for that. Does that answer your question? Can I clarify anything for you?
Yeah, it helps. It's just because I was looking at in the training kit, there's a challenge for specificity, and it says like you can't add any new IDs, no new classes, or no new HTML. So that's why it was tricky for me, because it'd be really easy to change the color if I could just change the class.
Okay.
Just more specific. But it was the one with grandchildren.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was just having trouble on that one.
Okay, and that's one where you can think about this type of approach here, because we've designated all A's. Let's see, we've designated. We didn't designate one, but if we do just A and then give that a color, brown, then you can use that law of descendancy to be able to select specific elements within a hierarchy to be able to give it a new color. Whereas because we're getting more specific of those locations, you don't have to add a new class. You don't have to do that. You just have to declare which one you're talking about, and that can give it a different color. That makes sense. That's another approach for doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Cool. All right, let's take a break now. Let's put on a timer for 5 minutes, and we will be back to talk about more of this stuff. See you soon. Okay, back. Any questions right off the bat? Okay. Here's a quick quiz on selector specificity. Which is more specific, a class or an ID? If we had both a class, an element with both a class and ID,
ID.
we're changing the same thing. Okay, good. Yeah, the ID overrides the class. Good. Awesome. So let's talk about inheritance a little bit. The same descendancy issues occur because elements inherit the styles of their parents, but this depends upon the style itself and if the child already has a value defined for that style. So let's look at another example here. Pull up this. Okay, we have, wait for this to refresh. Wrong. Again. All right, we have a parent, a child, and a grandchild. So what happens if we change the style of the parent? So let's say, maybe talk me through changing the class parent in that div. We use a declaration with a period to designate a class. You see the class name up here is parent. The parent. And we give that a color. If I change this class parent to color, or parent color to red, I don't know what's going on here. Let me start this. See if is anyone seeing an error in my code here. Class parent. Changing. I apologize for drawing the mic right here. I'm going to try and experiment with that same code, see if I can troubleshoot my error here. I go to the About page. And I'm going to copy my head information. This HTML. Do this body. Okay, we should be got some of our CSS here. Now I'm going to change the class to parent color red. Which is already here. So I'm going to comment this out. But what I'm trying to demonstrate for you is inheritance. So the way that the HTML is set up, we have class div as parent, and then we have another class, which is child, which is nested. Right now, the child and grandchild all nested under parent have red color. So if I add CSS for child and change the color to green, so this is the class of that div, and we'll refresh this. So now we see that we have a parent, which is the main element that then is overridden through the specificity of, we're talking about another class that's specific to child, but the grandchild class, although it is under the parent class, is inheriting the styles associated with its parent class. So the grandchild's parent is child, so it's inheriting from there. So now if I change this to include grandchild, oops, color blue, refresh, each one of those is different. So we're seeing the law of specificity at play as well as inheritance. So if we get rid of this child designation, what's your guess of what will happen to that child color right there? Any ideas?
It would be red because it would inherit it from its parent, right?
Okay, let's see. Yep, that's exactly right. So it's inheriting. We took away that specific designation, so it just goes back to its previous designation that it had inheritance. Okay, any questions about that? Nothing inside right now. I don't want to move on if that was confusing, but are you kind of getting a hang of specificity and inheritance? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. The next thing we want to talk about today is the box model, and that's the CSS box model is a foundation of layout on the web. And from the Mozilla Developer Network, they explain it that each element is represented basically as a rectangular box. The box is content, has padding, has a border, and a margin, all built up around one another like layers of an onion. And as the browser renders a web page layout, it works out what styles are applied to the content of each box, each of those onions, how big the surrounding onion layers are, where the boxes sit in relation to one another. So before we understand how to create CSS layouts, it's really good to be able to understand this box model, because every element within a document, an HTML document, is structured as that rectangular box inside that document layout, and the size and the onion layers that can be tweaked are done using CSS and specific properties associated with that. So let's look at this graphic really quickly to help us understand that visually. So any piece of content we put on any tag that we put into our HTML document that is displayed within that body tag, including the body tag, has these elements in this box model. So we have the content, whatever would be between those tags, or it might be an image in the case of an image tag. That content then has it's given a width and a height. Outside of that width and height is padding, spacing within between a border and that content. Then comes that border, and you can make the border any width as well. So they can be a very thick border, a very thin, even to invisible border. And then you have a margin, which defines the distance outside of that border compared to other elements as well. This is how the box model works. So let's use our code here to demonstrate a little bit about that, what that looks like. Let's see if we can go back to get this to work a little bit better. Right, we have these elements. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give everything a border. 1 point, solid black. So you can see that each of these elements, by giving them the border, we begin to see this box that we're talking about. And if we inspect these elements using the dev tools, we can begin to also see a little bit more about this box model, because the dev tools actually gives us some visuals of what that box model looks like. So when I hover over this, this is the content of that box. Then there's no padding that's been indicated. Then there's a border, which I just designated. And then there's a margin that's built into the way the browser represents the box model. So you can kind of see that in play in each of those elements. So if I go up to the first paragraph, you see the same things at play. And then the body tag actually has padding and border, and then the margin on the outside of it, showing it 8 pixels. So we can start adding pieces to these elements. As we begin to style, we can style our padding, and we'll maybe make it 10 pixels. And then you see that change that immediately happens. The content is then surrounded by additional space before the border. And if we update the border size to 3 points, that gives us our border size. And we can add a margin, the outside, we'll add 20 pixels. so that for the paragraph tags, it's adding space outside of the border, and it's basically 20 pixels outside of there that it guards that things can't touch, can't enter. So this is how we begin to get a sense for shaping the elements on the page. Understanding that each of these elements comes with its existing box will help us to be able to know how to manipulate it. And we see that the default action is to expand that box all the way across the size of the page. And then it also will automatically create a size that's the size of the content. But you can adjust those things as well. So height, you might want it to be 50 pixels, and we can designate that. And then the width, you want it to be a square, it could be 50 pixels as well. That gives us those elements, and we can begin to play around with those sizes and elements of the box model. Any questions about the box model? Right, there's one thing I want to mention about the default nature of how the browser treats the box model, and that is it starts with the size of the content and then builds the other elements out from there. So by default, if I give these height and width at 50 pixels, as soon as I add that padding, you can see it's created a box of 50 pixels. As soon as I add the padding, it's actually increasing the size of the box. So if I want to create a box that's actually 50 pixels big, then I have to begin doing mental math in my head to subtract out the padding before creating my box size. So I would have to say this is, okay, I want this to be 40 pixels by 40 pixels so that ultimately I have a 50 pixel size box. But there is a declaration that you can do, and it's good to do from this everything standpoint. So the very first declaration in your CSS can be something that helps solve for that, and that is box sizing, and it is border box. So border box, by changing the default action of the browser, rather than building out from the size of that content, you're actually saying height and width will be the baseline, and then padding will condense the content rather than expanding the box. Hopefully that makes sense. So now I can have my 50 pixel box. I still have my padding, but it's creating the size based on the box rather than on the content and expanding the size of the box. Any questions about that? Okay, we're going to start doing some editing on our actual employee dashboard. So I want to go back to the index and remove some of those tags that I had created, or some of those classes that I added to them. Class. Here. Okay, getting rid of those classes and going into my CSS and basically clearing out all of these designations that I did as demonstration. And then I want to go back and do box sizing, border box, like this. And close these other ones, they're not necessary. And then just so you know, this this button here on the IDE allows you to do a split editor. So now I can look at index and my CSS at the same time. That way I can switch back and forth much more easily, much more quickly as I try to make changes and updates. You can navigate with these as well. All right, I'm going to open up sketch file. Okay. If I can share this again. All right, I have my sketch file of this mockup that we've got. And I know that when developers, if we hand them just a mockup, they don't necessarily know the font, the color, and the size. They're just eyeballing it. But within a tool like Sketch, they're actually the tools of Sketch and Figma were actually created with web development in mind specifically, and so you can only create things that have a corollary within web presentation, the ability to render it into a browser. So if you if you right click on any element, you can get the CSS attributes that are associated with it. And you can copy the style, copy the CSS attributes. So the CSS attributes is what I'm going to copy. And then I'm going to go back to my CSS file over here. And I'm just going to paste what it was that I selected. And we have, I had selected, sorry, just to show what happened, I had selected this whole element, so it was grabbing the CSS for all of those pieces. I just wanted to grab this one, so I double click into it, into the group, copy the CSS attributes again, and come back over here and I'll paste again. Now I know that I'm looking at getting a font, so I need to make sure that I can access this Lotto font, and a lot of people may not have Lotto on their computer, and so you want to, what we use in modern web development is often a cloud-based solution for fonts. So Google Fonts is a good way, and I know that Google Fonts is where Lotto comes from. So I'm going to go to fonts.google.com. From here, I'm going to look for Lotto. And find it. So I select this font. Then by coming here, there's a little drawer here that helps me be able to grab the information. So this may seem familiar to you. It's another link, and we saw links earlier today. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that link. What this is going to do, we talk about adding to our head. You can go ahead and paste that in here. And they've got their rel in a different order than we have in ours, but again, it's a style sheet that when we reach out here to https fonts.googleapis.com, then it will pull in this information about this font family so that we can then use it in our application or on the web. So it's another use for a link tag. And you would always want your CSS that you're doing, your custom CSS, to come as the very last thing because of the specificity rules, and the last thing that's put in will override any other CSS declarations in other people's code. So you know that you're in control of the final appearance of your document. So you see the code that they use for implementing the Lotto font based on their CSS that they've provided that we've just embedded. Then we're going to copy and paste that into here. You can see that there's a little bit of a discrepancy between what Sketch provided for us and what Google provided for us. I'm going to go with Google because I know that their styles are going to be the most updated for what we need to use for applying that. So I'm going to apply this to our logo. So I'd like someone to tell me, how would I apply this CSS that I've copied and pasted to our employee logo as it appears in our designs? Anyone have an idea?
I would do start it up with, let me get it here real quick. The hashtag pound hashtag logo, and then the curly bracket open, and then close it up at the end.
Okay, great. So well, I'm going to just tab those over so it helps with readability. But great, yeah, it's an ID. We would probably want to choose the ID as opposed to the element, because we usually only have one H1 on a page, but you're really only supposed to have one ID on a page. So we get as specific as we can to be able to deal with that. So we add font family Lotto, sans serif. Font size is an attribute. We give it 21 pixels. The color is very specific. It's a hex code. And then we've got letter spacing, which is 0.5 pixels. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that. And we'll come back to employee dashboard and refresh. Now we can see that if we inspect this, we have H1 ID logo. Come down and we can see the styling that it's been given, this ID logo, just like we designated, Lotto, sans serif, 21 pixels, color, and the letter spacing. It's there as we expect. And if I inspect one of these elements, they haven't been styled yet, so it's the default. We've got the box sizing declaration that we made, but everything else is based on what's default. Everything's auto padding, nothing's been designated there. Probably it's good to note that the way we designate fonts is we get the specific font we want as the primary element. It's the first one here. And then we can comma separate additional fonts that would then be fallbacks in case somebody didn't have Lato, or for some reason the Google APIs had gone defunct. So it would fall back to a sans serif font. You can have as many fonts in this stack as you need, but generally it's going to be the main font you want, maybe one backup, and then going to sans serif. Okay. So this would be a good point at which you could hopefully be following along to be able to see who or how we manage these CSS changes as well. Before we continue, let's look at Slido. Let's see if anyone's posted any questions. Anyone else have any questions or thoughts right now? Okay, I'd like you as a class to talk me through how would I handle styling some of the other elements of this navigation?
You're gonna change the H2s to the purple color, and then the A. What was the name of the A attribute?
The anchor tag.
Anchor. And then change the anchor tags to the gray.
Okay.
Oh wait, no, that's a P, right?
Let's stick with starting with the nav element. So let's look at that. And we will copy the CSS attributes again.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to Visual Studio. Oh, one thing that I forgot about in the logo, was that this was bolded, and when I copied and pasted the text from Google APIs, I didn't have the bold in place. So I'm going to go back in there and do font weight bold. Then we can see refresh. That. Okay, so this next one is for anchor tags. So we do an A. And since I'm doing copying and pasting, you can't really do that. I'll try not to go too fast so that you can copy some of those elements in as you're following along to get the feel for that. And I think it's really good practice when you're first starting to do CSS and HTML is to actually type things out, and that helps you remember things a little bit more easily later on. So if I just do anchor tags and I change these to match this, the color is gray, better spacing. What's going to happen to all of my anchor tags once I come back here?
They should all turn the color gray and change to the to the different typeface.
Yeah. So everything's going to change, but it's changing not only my navigation items, but also all of my elements in the cards. And when we look at the design, it doesn't look like it's the same font size or color right now to me. So just be aware of that. If we come in and we start making changes, you have to realize the level of specificity that you're at and what changes it's going to make, and it's going to cascade down to everything else And that's okay now if we want to get more specific later. But what if we decide to get more specific now? How would we try to shape this? Well, to have somebody else answer. I think your answers have been great so far, but who else can help us? How
We
can
would
we be specific for
specify
this
the
one?
sections.
Say that again.
We would specify, so if we're working specifically on the navigation, we would then develop sections for the different font styles for the other cards.
Okay.
Because they're right now in sections, and then the anchor tags can be different in the sections versus the navigation.
Okay. Good. That would definitely work. So if we come down and we say section A, then we can change the color just as a demonstration. We go back and refresh. And so, yeah, in the beginning up here, these are gray like they should be, and then these ones have been changed back to red. So yeah, that's definitely a way that we can do that. And we probably will. We can also be more specific here so that if we make a more general declaration about A's later on, we're not changing everything by surprise. So we do the same thing here that we would do down there and do nav A, and that way we can avoid that, making those changes. So let's delete these and see what difference that makes. We're just designating nav A as those styles. And so these go back to the default browser display, and these ones are the style that's specified. And one thing someone mentioned about the underlines, when I get rid of those links. Underline is the paradigm from the earliest days of the web for designating links, but underlining inhibits readability. So you have kind of this clash between expected behavior versus the affordance that's provided, and then versus readability and usability issues. But if I wanted to avoid having underlines on any of my anchors, then I would go up to here and say font decoration. Let's see, text decoration. Then start out with, and that would help me avoid having underlines on my links. You can do that at a more specific level, but if you're gonna never want those, then you can put it at a more general level and then override it as you need to as you move forward.
So the decorations, text decoration none would also eliminate any hovering if you put it in the asterisk section?
I don't think it would. I mean, it would remove the underline on hover if that's what you mean, but I don't think it eliminates hover altogether, because hover is a pseudo class. And so let's see what happened.
Yeah, so only the cursor indicates that it has affordance.
Yeah, okay. I can't remember what it was doing before, what the default behavior was. It was basically doing the same thing. It was just hovering at the same style that it had before. So it wasn't that declaration that makes that change. So what we can do, do you remember how to add a hover state?
Yeah, colon, hover. And good. You add all of them? No, that's
Say
it.
that again. Yeah, so yeah, just that hover as the pseudo class. And we're going to make the hover be, I don't think we have a specification in our design. And this is where somewhere when developers are creating these designs, I think, okay, so what's the hover state? And as a designer, we think, oh, what are all these pieces that the developer is going to need to be able to create? They're thinking about it, and if we don't give them something, then they make something up. And that's where conflicts often come, is developers are just trying to do their job and get all the pieces that they know need to be there. Sometimes we can overlook those. So there's no hover state that's designated. I'm just going to, for the sake of the fun of the class, color is green. That's what I would choose for design. So now we have a green hover on that. No hover on those because we've got the specificity designated here that it's a nav A hover as opposed to a hover for general. So another another pseudo class we could do is, let's see, active. Oops. Let's see if this will work for CSS attributes. Oops. Go back here, paste them in. We're going to update these other things that I've copied in from Sketch to make sure they match Google's expectations. Size 16. And then we actually don't need to add all those other ones in because we just would need to override the color, because nav A already has all of these other attributes about it. So that the hover right now, the only thing we want to, or sorry, the active state, the only thing we want to change is its dark color. Oops. Active may not work with just H tag or A tags. Oh. So instead of doing a pseudo class, we're actually going to give this a class of active. So class equals active. We're getting the styling that's more correct. Okay, so this is basic introduction to how CSS works. What questions do you have right now? All right, let's review the assignment for today. Our project, there's basically 2 code pens available. That there's a CSS walkthrough and then a CSS practice. And you can review the mockup that's provided there and just use your knowledge of CSS to build that out. And then for stretch goals, pick one of your daily UI challenges, turn that content into HTML and CSS. And we haven't really covered complicated layouts, but you know a little bit about box model and how to put some of those things together. Can you figure out, and can you use W3 schools or other online resources to enhance your knowledge, be able to get to some of those places? If you get through the CSS stuff pretty fast, give that a shot, experiment. It'll help you expand your understanding. And if you hit roadblocks, try for 20 minutes and see what you can get on your own, and then at that point, then reach out for help for sure, because we don't want to have you get any blockers. And then your submission as usual through a Google Doc. Still no questions in Slido? What can I help clarify, or are there any more demonstrations of some of the stuff that we've talked about that you'd like me to go through to help solidify some of these concepts? If not, then I will stay on until everybody's gone, but feel free to ask additional questions. Happy to help whatever way I can. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
I have a question for the first code pen.
Okay.
In the CSS, it gives us all the different fonts. All the different
You're
types.
talking about this one. Okay.
Yeah, so we just find out which elements on the mockup are that certain font and then assign it to them in the CSS? Or how do we find out which font is which?
So this mockup here, this ping, if you go to look at that, then you should be able to see what the font looks like. And then if you look on at what those fonts look like in these should all be in the Apple system, so you can look at what they look like in your own files, and then you can say, okay, that one matches this font. If that makes sense.
Okay, so we just have to do it by eye, pretty much.
Yeah. As far as I know, I actually didn't set up that comp, so I'm not sure where the original file is, because I wouldn't be able to tell you either unless I looked at it and did that comparison. If you like really super stumped, then let us know, but we can help.
Okay.
Any other questions?
So I'm seeing that the border rounding is 4 pixels. Is that different than the border radius? Because I was looking in the W3 school for CSS tags, and I'm not seeing one for border rounding. I'm seeing some for border radius.
Yeah, that's the same.
Same thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
Yep.
cool. Thank you, appreciate it.
You bet. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Cool. Gabe, Kyla, any comments or